Her hands were shaking, and she just wanted one true answer. She'd been sitting in the chair across from mine for maybe 10 minutes. I'll call her Renee. And she looked at me with this kind of exhausted hope, like she'd been saving up the question for weeks. "Just tell me," she said. "Tell me the next right thing and I'll do it. I just need to know I'm not making a mistake." And I sat there with my tea going cold, because I know that feeling from the inside. I spent the first 22 years of my life believing that if you just had enough data, enough certainty, you could avoid the pain of choosing wrong. I was a physicist before I was anything else. I liked equations because they didn't change their minds on you. Life, it turns out, does not work that way. Life hands you half the variables and tells you to move anyway. So that's where we're starting today. Not with an answer. I don't have one, not really, not the kind Renee wanted. We're starting with this. You don't need it all figured out to move forward. You just need to be willing to take the next step before the map is finished. I know how that sounds. I spent years not believing it either. If that lands somewhere true for you, if you've been standing at some edge of your life waiting for a certainty that isn't coming, I'm glad you're here. Welcome to Breathe and Begin. I'm Sarah, psychologist, single mom, recovering physicist, a woman who's made nearly every mistake I'm about to walk you through. If something in here finds you today, tell me in the comments. I read them, and they matter more to me than you'd guess. And if you want to keep having these conversations, stick around and subscribe. There's more ground to cover, and I'd like to cover it with you. I want to say something else before we get into it. This isn't going to be 10 neat steps to certainty. I don't have those, and honestly, I'd be a little suspicious of anyone who claims they do. What I have is a handful of true stories, mine and a few borrowed from people who've sat in the chair across from me, about what it actually looks like to move when the picture isn't finished. Some of it's going to sound small. Good. Small is usually where the real movement happens. Now let me tell you what it actually cost me to learn this, and what I hope it costs you less. I was 12 when I learned that bodies don't follow equations. My mother got sick that year, lupus, though it took the doctors months to put a name to it, and the house that used to smell like fresh bread started smelling like rubbing alcohol instead. I became the kid who managed things, schedules, medications, the quiet calculus of a household trying not to fall apart. And somewhere in there, without ever saying it out loud, I decided that needing things from other people was a kind of danger, safer to require nothing. Physics found me not long after, and I loved it for the wrong reason. Not because it was beautiful, though it is, but because it never lied to me. 2 + 2 stayed put. An equation, once balanced, stayed balanced. Here's the thing nobody tells you about loving certainty that much, though. You start believing you're not allowed to move until you have it. Waiting starts to feel like wisdom. A lot of the time, it's just fear, wearing a lab coat. I carried that into adulthood without noticing. I picked a major that promised proof. I picked friendships I could predict. And underneath all of it sat the same 12-year-old logic. If I can just know enough, nothing will be able to surprise me, and nothing will be able to hurt me the way watching my mother's body fail me did. It took a long time to understand that certainty was never actually on the menu. Not for her illness, not for anyone's life, mine included. At 38, after my marriage ended, I packed 2 kids and a U-Haul and drove to a state I'd never lived in. My plan, in its entirety, was not there anymore. No job lined up that would last, no real budget, a rundown rental I'd found over the phone, sight unseen. And the whole drive west, some old MIT version of me kept whispering, "You can't do this. You haven't solved for the variables yet." But, and I want you to sit with this part, I moved anyway. Not because I had it figured out, because staying still had stopped being the safe option, even though it looked safer on paper. Sometimes the math doesn't resolve before you have to leave the room. I think about that drive a lot now. 2 kids asleep in the back seat, a state I'd chosen mostly because it was far and it was green. I didn't know yet that the rental would have a leaky roof, or that I'd be eating cereal for dinner more nights than I'd ever admit to a client. I just knew that the version of my life I'd been living had run out of road. So I found new road. you don't always get to see where it leads before you turn onto it.
Here's something I tell clients constantly, and I mean it clinically, not just as a nice line. Your brain treats uncertainty like danger. That's not a flaw in your character, that's wiring. Your nervous system would rather have a bad plan than no plan, because no plan can feel like standing at the edge of a dark room with no idea how far down the floor is. So if you're stuck, paralyzed, waiting for enough information before you'll let yourself act, understand what's actually happening underneath that. You're not lazy. You're not weak. Some part of you is trying to protect you from a fall it can't yet measure. And look, that protective instinct isn't wrong exactly. It kept your ancestors from walking off ledges in the dark. The problem is it doesn't know the difference between a literal cliff and a hard conversation, a career change, a decision to finally end something that isn't working. It treats all of it like the same dark room. Part of growing up, I think, is teaching that old instinct the difference. Gently, slowly, one survived risk at a time. The trouble is, some falls you can't measure from where you're standing. You only find the ground by stepping toward it. I've told this story before, so I'll keep it short, but it belongs here. I was 45, a gray, drizzly Tuesday, the kind where everything feels a half step too hard. Spilled milk. A meltdown about rain boots. Me white-knuckling the wheel. And from the back seat, my son, 7 years old, asked, "Mom, are you happy?" I didn't have an answer. I'd been performing fine for so long, I'd forgotten I was allowed to not know. I pulled the car over. I cried, really cried, for the first time in front of him. And his small hand landed on my shoulder, and he said, "It's okay, Mommy. You can be sad." I didn't fix anything that day. I didn't figure out my life in that parking lot. I just let it stay unfinished, out loud for once. And something in me finally exhaled. Looking back, that parking lot was the real beginning of everything that came after. The practice, the kind of mother I tried to become, even this. Not because I'd solved a single thing, because I'd finally stopped pretending I had. So, back to Renee from the top of this episode. I didn't give her the answer she came in wanting. What I gave her instead was this. What if the next right thing isn't a destination? What if it's just the smallest honest move you can make today? She did not love that answer. Nobody does the first time. We want the GPS voice telling us turn left in 200 feet. What we usually get is fog and a flashlight. But she came back the next week and told me she'd done one small thing, told her sister the truth about her marriage, out loud for the first time. Not the whole plan, just the one true step that was actually in front of her. She still didn't know how the marriage would end up. She still doesn't, last I checked. But something had shifted in her posture by the second visit. The particular shoulders of someone who stopped waiting for permission to start. I grew up believing that needing anything from anyone was a kind of weakness, that the safest way to survive was to require nothing. And look, that belief kept 12-year-old me functional in a house that was quietly falling apart. It served a purpose once. But it isn't true. Strength, I've come to think, looks a lot more like Renee in that chair, hand shaking, asking the question anyway. Strength is moving without the certainty, not waiting for the fear to leave the room first, because for a lot of us, it doesn't fully leave. Ever. You just learn to drive with it in the passenger seat. It took me well into my 40s to understand that asking for help, admitting confusion, saying, "I don't know what I'm doing," out loud to another adult, none of that is the opposite of strength. It's just strength that finally stopped performing for an audience. I had a client years ago, I'll call him James, who came in wanting to overhaul his entire life in one weekend. New job, new city, fix the marriage or end it, all of it, now, because he'd finally figured out what was wrong. I asked him what he could actually do today, just today. He said he could call his brother, who he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. That was the whole plan. That's it. And 6 months later, the rest of it, the job, the marriage, the move, had genuinely started shifting. Not because he solved his life in a weekend, because he stopped waiting for the weekend that would let him solve it. I think about James whenever someone tells me they're still planning. Planning has its place. But a lot of what looks like planning is just a very respectable sounding way of staying still. The brother phone call didn't require a 5-year strategy. It required a Tuesday afternoon and a willingness to feel awkward for about 90 seconds.
Now, I want to be careful here, because "you don't need it all figured out" is not a permission slip to drive off a cliff just because the cliff felt decisive. There's a real difference between moving forward without certainty and moving forward without any sense at all. Reckless ignores the information you do have. Ready says, "Here's what I know, here's what I don't, and I'm choosing to act inside that gap anyway." So how do you tell the difference, in the moment, when both can feel like the same nervous system jolt? I usually ask myself one question. Am I running toward something, or just running from the discomfort of standing still? Running from discomfort tends to skip steps. Running toward something, even an unclear something, tends to still take the next sensible step in front of it. And honestly, some days the line between the two is thinner than I'd like to admit, even for me, and I've got the degree. I once kept a spectacularly unimpressive houseplant alive for 2 years, purely on personal growth grounds. That one you can file under reckless. My daughter asked me last year if I was scared, starting the therapy practice on my own. I told her the truth. Yes. I didn't have a 5-year plan. I had a lease, 2 mismatched armchairs, and a photo of the Andromeda Galaxy I liked looking at when I needed to feel small in a good way. She asked how I did it without knowing how it would turn out. I told her you don't get the how it turns out part first. You get the next room, the next client, the next Tuesday. The turning out comes later, and it usually looks nothing like what you pictured going in, and that's all right too. She didn't love that answer either, if I'm honest. Teenagers want certainty even more than adults do, I think, because they haven't yet had enough evidence that the uncertain thing usually turns out survivable. So I just kept showing her, not telling her, showing her, that the lease got signed, the clients kept coming, and the practice, somehow, slowly, became a real thing. So here's where I've landed, all these years and detours later. The map doesn't exist before you start walking. You make it as you go, sometimes badly, sometimes by flashlight, sometimes by pulling the car over on a gray Tuesday and just admitting out loud that you don't know. You don't need the whole figured out life to take the next step. You need the next step. That's genuinely all that's ever been asked of you. So if you came into this episode the way Renee came into my office, hands a little shaky, hoping I'd hand you a finished map, I'm sorry to disappoint you. And also, I think some part of you already knew there wasn't one. There never was. Not for me at 22, grieving a future I thought I'd already mapped out. Not at 38, driving west with a U-Haul and no real plan. Not at 45, pulled over on the shoulder while my son told me it was okay to be sad. What there was, every single time, was a next small thing. A phone call, a drive, a pulled over car, a question asked instead of swallowed whole. You don't need it all figured out. You need the next honest move, and then the one after that, and then the one after that. That's the whole secret, if you can even call it one. It isn't glamorous. It isn't a tidy ending. It's just true. If this found you at the right moment tonight, I'd love to know. Leave a comment and tell me what your next small thing might be. And if you want to keep having these conversations with me, hit subscribe. It helps more than you'd think, and it means I get to keep showing up here week after week with you. Wherever you are right now, however unfinished your life feels tonight, you're allowed to take the next step without the rest of the plan. That's enough. You're enough. Exactly as unfinished as you are.